it's time for us to check back in with Sidney Saylor Farr and see what happens next in the book. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. This is Chapter 10, Sweet and Meat. Making molasses is a ritual of autumn as old as any civilization that has endured in the hills. We always had molasses at our house because almost every year Dad and some of his brothers, along with Grandpa, planted a cooperative crop of cane. From this one patch, they would get enough molasses to supply their families for the entire year. And like other of their reciprocal understandings, if they did not plant cane one year, they helped their neighbors cut, gather, and process their crops through the stir-off process and received gallons of molasses in return. Molasses, amber magic. Early in the fall, when the cane was ripe, Dad and his brothers cut it and separated the stalks from the blades. Sometimes they cut a piece of cane into joints and gave them to us children to chew for juice. The juice was wonderfully sweet and satisfying, but we had to be careful not to cut our lips on the sharp and biting edges of the bark. When the cane was harvested, the men dug a trench, built up low rock ledges on each side, and set in place the long cane press vat they used to boil the juice. Not everyone could afford a cane press. Usually one man in the community would buy one and loan it out for use. A toll of a quart of molasses was the fee in Stony Fort for using the cane press. When the vat was in place, Dad cleaned the cane mill and got it ready for use the next day. Last of all, the helpers cut enough wood to feed the fire several hours. Word would already have gone out that a big stir-off was taking place the next day, and everyone in the neighborhood felt free to drop by. Early the next morning, Dad hitched old Bob, our mule, to the cane mill and delegated James to watch him and see that he walked at a steady, even gait. He hitched old Bob to a long pole, or sweep. A rod had been mounted horizontally in and at right angles to the butt end of the sweep, and a line tied to it which ran to old Bob's halter. When the sweep was pulled forward, the line connected to the butt would keep pulling the mule around in a circle. The sweep turned a crusher roller in the mill, which in turn engaged another roller, forcing it to turn also. The men fed the cane in between the rollers. The cane was fed into the mill on one side, the rollers crushed it dry, and green juice came out the other side into a trough that ran down to a covered container. From there it was taken to the boiler and poured through several layers of cheesecloths to filter it before it entered the vat. They would fill the vat to within 2 or 3 inches of the top. The vat held about 80 gallons of juice, which boiled down to 8 to 10 gallons of molasses. Neighbors up and down the road gathered, eager to sample the molasses and have a good time. They brought buckets, jars, and bowls to carry home some of the finished product. As the juice boiled down, they skimmed off the rich yellow foam with wooden paddles or spoons and ate their fill as they sat or stood in groups and talked or joined in singing, square dancing, or playing ball. I have since learned that for hundreds of years, molasses was considered a poor substitute for sugar, its pungent flavor being found unsuitable for the finer tables and the more developed palates in the land. Only wealthy people could afford the expense of sugar. The less affluent had to rely on other means of sweetening their food, such as using molasses and honey. The early settlers in America had little choice when it came to sweetening because until the mid-19th century, refined sugar was prohibitively expensive and difficult to obtain. Maple sugar and maple syrup were available in some areas, but by the 18th century, most families in America used molasses in a variety of ways to moisten their hoe cakes and baked beans, to sweeten pork dishes, and to make steamed Indian pudding palatable. Pioneer women found that because molasses had such an intense flavor, it stood up well to heavy spicing in foods, ginger in gingerbread, allspice in rich, moist fruit cake, mustard with tender baked beans, and cloves in succulent cuts of pork. Another good companion to molasses was whole grains such as water-ground cornmeal, stone-ground whole wheat, and tangy rye, which women used to make loaves of chewy, nutritious bread. When sugar refining methods were developed and the price of sugar went down, more and more housewives began to relegate molasses to the category of specialty foods. In Appalachia, molasses never lost its important place on the pantry shelf. Women could be more lavish in its use in baked goods because it was made at home and therefore relatively inexpensive. It is ironic that molasses, so long out of favor with the average cook because of its humble connotations, is now much more expensive than refined sugar. I think of autumn as stir-off days. During the summer months, the mountains seem to sink in hazy sleep, their topmost peaks wrapped in blue smoke. But when fall weather comes, they wake up and explode in color. During this pause between sleepy summer and shivering winter, when the nights turn cool but the sky is blue in the daytime and the sun shines warm and bright, mountain people would harvest their crops and make molasses, just as their forefathers did in the oldest of times. Butchering time. Memories of fall seasons of my childhood bring back thoughts of pawpaws, persimmons, walnuts, and hickory nuts, potatoes and cabbages, late apples, and other delicious things to gather and eat. For us children, autumn also meant looking forward to the first snowfall and to the holidays of Thanksgiving and Christmas. At this time of the year, we would be getting ready to butcher the hogs Dad had been fattening in pens for a few weeks. The hogs ran wild in the mountains. Dad and Grandpa caught them and put them into pens to harden their fat before they were butchered around Thanksgiving, when it had just begun to get cold. We had no electricity to run refrigerators and freezers, so the weather had to be cold enough to chill the meat. Mama, my sisters, and I dreaded this chore. Dad usually just had a handsaw and a sharp butcher knife to cut the meat. Everything was done the hard way. Mama used a hand grinder to grind all the fat for lard and to use in sausage. She depended on the children to help do the major part of this arm-wrenching, back-breaking chore. Mama would start rendering kettles of lard, then frying the sausage before canning it. I remember all too well the feel of the greasy handle of the sausage mill and the smell of hot grease. Since the pork sausage, chops, and tenderloins could not be kept in the smokehouse with the rest of the meat without spoiling, they were cooked and canned with lard rendered out of the same hog. Mama would also can the ribs and backbone. It was good to have hot pork, sauerkraut, and a square of cornbread to eat on a cold winter's day. Dad would cure the ham, side meat, and shoulders in a brown sugar and salt brine, and then he would hang them up to smoke in the smokehouse. This was the hard way to do it, but modern meat processing methods can never produce the flavor of that pork. We used every scrap of the hog. Nothing went to waste. Mama would make sauce out of the head, cooking it until the meat fell off the bone. The pig ears were cooked tender and chopped along with the head meat. The chopped meat and broth were then mixed with fresh chopped garlic, onion, dill, pickles, sage, a little vinegar, and salt and pepper. The mixture was placed in loaf pans and chilled overnight. It could then be turned out on a platter and sliced. The feet, minus the hooves, were scraped, cooked, tender, and pickled. It shocked some people when I mentioned some of the things we used to eat. Chicken feet, for example. Mama would chop off the toes, parboil and peel the feet, then dip them in seasoned flour and fry them. We children never fought to get a fried chicken foot, but we ate them if we were told to do so. We were never allowed to waste a scrap of food. Winter's Counsel. Mom and Dad were married during the Great Depression, but they knew before then that life was hard and everyone had to make do with what they had. I remember how I detested garden peas. If I ate just 1 or 2 peas, I would get a headache. It was a point of contention for a while between Mom and me, but eventually I outgrew my dislike, and today I love fresh garden peas. There was never any problem getting us to eat what was set before us. There was no, I don't like that, or I'm not going to eat this at our house. We knew we would either eat it or go hungry. I used to think the November hills always had sad faces, and I was always glad to see December spread out a white veil to cover the mountains when winter was upon us. When the snowy days of winter fall across the land of the summer's dead, I think of gray nuns walking through an orchard counting the seasons lost while propensely counting those ahead. During this time of the year, we hear the word season more than any other time of the year. There is the holiday season leading up to New Year's Day. We also speak of the cold season, the flu season, the rainy season, and others. When I was young, I felt the turning seasons of the years in my heart, and now as I get older, I also feel them in my bones. Hearing colors, making wreaths. The fall and early winter season brings me thoughts of warm, fuzzy things. I yearn for cozy places, good books, and the company of loved ones. Nature brings a wide selection of colors in the fall, and technology brings vivid hues as the holiday season approaches. I love the color of things. I invite colors to drift before my closed eyes, holding each for a deep look, then sending it along to make room for others. At the same time, I hear the colors as if each were spoken aloud. Each color seems to have its own resonance, its own glow and health. In school, I could hardly wait for the teacher to give us pictures to color for the holidays. My favorite pictures were of Christmas wreaths. When I got older, I researched how wreaths came into being. I found out that they existed in ancient cultures and were a symbol of royalty when worn around the head. They were called diadems, from a Greek word meaning to bind around. Fresh laurel and oak leaves were used for garlands, which became symbols of power for political and military leaders. Leaves were used as prizes to recognize athletes. This practice probably brought about the phrase, "to earn your laurels," or "don't rest on your laurels." The olive branch has also become a symbol of peace. Head wreaths became status symbols, which led to the development of ornate crowns for the elite. A crown of thorns was used when Christ was crucified as an act of ridicule and humiliation. Wreaths also became a symbol of love, an unending circle that symbolizes eternity. The wreath was used to commemorate the missing spirit at the most somber of events, funerals. History does not tell us when the wreath as a head adornment was adapted to a wreath as a door or wall decoration. Traditionally in our country, wreaths have hung on entrance doors or over the fireplace. They seem to reflect the mood or ambiance of whatever the occasion happens to be. Wreaths are used today to beautify as well as to reflect personality and color. Barbara Power is the head of the circulation desk at the college library where I worked for 24 years. She and her late husband, Paul, lived in Berea. Barbara is a talented gardener, clever with needle and thread, and skilled with various handicraft materials. One year she made a large dried wreath that she hung over her buffet in the dining room. The wreath was composed of various kinds of dried materials, including tiny pink rosebuds. When the library staff gathered at her house for a Christmas potluck, I stood for several moments admiring the flawlessly crafted decoration. Mountain craftspeople use dried nuts, pine cones, and other material to make wreaths in natural shades of brown and sand, which they sell in craft shops every Christmas. One year I decided to make one just like theirs, although I was neither as skilled nor as talented as they in being able to capture the mood of the season using such items. Nevertheless, I made a wreath and hung it in my house. All through that Christmas season, whenever it was quiet and peaceful, we'd hear a sharp crack or a dull thud, depending on whether it was a nut or a pine cone falling to the hardwood floor, bouncing and rolling. I discarded that poor wreath and never tried to make another one with nuts, pine cones, and a hot glue gun. Of course, my son Bruce has managed to introduce suggestions and comments about Mom's Christmas wreath every Christmas since, warning others in the house to watch out for Mom's wreath, as they might get poked in the head with a buckeye or a pine cone. Chapter 11, Winter's Hunger and Cold. When winter comes, the ground freezes and all signs of growing things are removed. The winter months always remind me of cold and hunger. I don't know why this should be, because even in Appalachia we always had food to eat. It may have been only a kettle of pinto beans cooked with a ham bone, a bowl of fried potatoes, and home-canned pickles with a pan of hot cornbread, but it was filling, and we never went to bed with empty stomachs. Perhaps the memory of cold and hunger has a racial or ethnic origin. Through stories and accounts handed down from one generation to another, we all knew of starvation, the inability to pay rent, and being cast out into the cold by ruthless landlords. Grandpa told me that our ancestors were forced to leave the highlands of Scotland and go to Ireland, where they lived and intermarried until the great potato famine come, driving some of them out of Ireland, leaving them with no choice but to immigrate to the New World. When they arrived, the more accessible parts of the country were already settled and turned into towns and cities. My ancestors kept moving until they arrived in western North Carolina. They found the mountains to be somewhat similar to the land from which they had come, making it seem natural to settle there. Eventually, half the group went into Virginia and the other half came into the Kentucky mountains, where they homesteaded in the hollows and valleys with no one house in sight of another. My many times removed great-grandpa cleared land at the head of Stony Fork. His children settled in hollows around him, and their children did the same until Stony Fork was populated with sailors. Irish potatoes. In the Kentucky mountains where I grew up, some farmers planted their potatoes on March 17th through swirling snowflakes because St. Patrick's Day was the traditional potato planting day. Others waited until the 100th day of the year, April 10th, to put out their potatoes. I don't know what special significance was attached to that day. We called the white potatoes Irish potatoes, and along with dried beans, they composed the backbone of our diet. Perhaps because of our Scots-Irish inheritance, we had an inborn love for potatoes, but then good country grub has always included beans and potatoes. Sunday dinners always featured a huge bowl of fluffy mashed potatoes, and through the week we ate potatoes boiled, fried, baked, and creamed. Our favorite potato dish was the tiny new potato that we gravelled out with a fork early in the growing season, after which we covered the whole. Mama served them with a white sauce. Dad fussed that we were destroying his crop by graveling the new potatoes, but he always ate them as eagerly as we did. Anytime we went on a picnic, we packed Mama's big iron skillet and some potatoes. To my way of thinking, there is nothing in the world half so good as potatoes fried in an iron skillet over a campfire along with boiled coffee. Another favorite was Mama's potato cakes. She would use leftover mashed potatoes, mix in 1 or 2 chopped onions, add an egg, and mix well. She fried the little round cakes in bacon grease until they were golden brown. I make potato cakes that taste like dressing by adding chopped celery, a pinch of sage, chopped onion, and an egg. Another variation, instead of patties, I put the mixture in a buttered casserole dish and bake it in the oven until lightly browned on top. During winter days and evenings when we wanted a snack, we would put potatoes in the hot ashes in the fireplace and roast them. This gave them a wonderful taste, far superior to baked potatoes. Perhaps the wood ashes and smoke were responsible for the flavor. When they were done, we would rake them out, peel off the skin, season them with butter and salt, and eat them hot. When the potatoes that we had planted had matured and were dug up in the fall, Dad put them into burlap sacks, hauled the sacks to the corn crib, and spread them out to dry. Just before cold weather froze the ground, he would hole them up for winter. First, he dug a big round hole in the garden nearest the house. He would line the hole with straw and add enough potatoes to make a big mound above the ground. Then he put straw over the top of the mound, packing it carefully along all the edges. He covered the mound with a layer of dirt. Last of all, he would put flat boards over the top, slanting them toward the ground at one end to drain off water. During the wintertime, we would dig in the side of the mound and reach through the straw to take as many potatoes as we needed. Potatoes holed up this way kept sound and good through most of the winter. They did not shrivel or rot, although they did begin to sprout when the ground warmed up in early spring. Dad holed up cabbage the same way when we had a good crop, and sometimes apples too, although they did not keep as well as cabbage or potatoes. Corn to the grist mill. Dad took our corn down the creek to Morgan Helton's grist mill to be ground. I always begged to go with him, but usually Mama said no because the men were apt to drink and play cards while they waited for the corn to be ground. It was awesome to me how the water wheel turned the stones to grind the grains of corn. Early pioneer farmers had to grind their grain by hand with mortars or handstones until the arrival of the water wheel in the late 1700s revolutionized the process. The first millers brought the knowledge required to build grist mills with them from England. Soon many small towns and communities in the region had their own grist mills. The grist mills in the mountains varied in size and efficiency. Even though the water wheel was the core of every mill, some mills had water wheels outside the building. When they were inside, they were called turbine or tub wheels. Buckets or troughs attached to the wheel filled with water which spilled into the next bucket, causing the wheel slowly to turn. Wheels of this type, where the water flows from the top, are referred to as an overshot. Those using water that is carried upward from the bottom is described as an undershot. I learned that there were two ways of powering the mills. Logs or stones might be stretched across a stream to create a mill pond, water rushing through a controlled sluice, a box in channel, in the dam passed over or under the wheel. The water turned the wheel, thus setting in motion cogs, shafts, and pulleys in the mill that powered the grinding stones. Another way was to divert water from nearby streams and channel it through pipes to the edge of the mill, then shoot it into buckets in the water wheel. Millstones usually came from local quarries, but a few French burr stones were imported from France. Two stones, 4 feet in diameter, were placed on top of one another. The bottom stone was stationary. Half-inch grooves cut into the center of the stones enabled corn fed from a hopper down between the stones to grind the corn and pass it outward into a pulley-operated conveyor belt that moved it to a box ready for sacking. Back in pioneer days, the miller would set certain meal days when settlers could bring in their corn to be ground. The grist mill was both a social meeting place and a necessity. Fire was one nemesis of grist mills, and floods were another. Some mills burned to the ground and others washed away. Civil War armies burned hundreds of mills to deprive communities of their food. A few were rebuilt, but many were not. When Dad took corn to the mill, he described it as taking a turn of corn to the mill on grinding day. The miller performed his services for a toll, usually a gallon of corn for 2 bushels of ground meal. It is sad to me that water wheels and grist mills, once so important to the survival of many, are now tourist attractions. Grist mills that once ground corn into meal now simply grind out dollars for their owners. The Old Moon in February. Grandpa and his pa before him on Stony Fork each set store by the moon and the stars and other kind of folklore. They would be quick to explain the reason why floors buck, doors warp, shingles curl, and fence rails rot. They would say they went again the moon. When the moon is full, timber fibers warp and pull. According to them, there was a difference in wood cut 3 hours before the new moon and that cut 6 hours after. Dad held to certain beliefs about the weather. Sometimes on a winter night, the fire in the grate would make a noise like someone whose boots went scrunch through the snow. When the fire made sounds like this, Dad would say it was going to snow. It always did. I've since learned that as early as 1300 BC, people believed there were intimate connections between man and the celestial bodies. Astrologers used the zodiac as a guide to nearly everything. Butchering hogs, pulling teeth, fishing, forecasting the weather, milking cows, baking, cooking, and all phases of farming and wellness. Grandpa always said the old moon in February is the right time for cutting timber that will stand forever straight and true. In the old days in Appalachia, men knew how to hand-cut timber and rough lumber. When Grandpa and the other old-timers in the mountains cut down trees, rived shingles, or even cut firewood, they did it according to the signs of the moon. Today, much of their lore is looked upon as mere superstition. Perhaps that explains why today's lumber is considered inferior to that used in the old days. When Dad rived our boards for our house roof, as well as for the barn, crib, and smokehouse, he was careful to go with the grain because shingles split with the grain shed rain, while shingles cut across the grain hold water and rot. He also believed that boards and shingles should be put on when the horn of the new moon points down. Then they won't cup up on you, he would say. When you see a roof with the boards all cupped up, they were put on in the light of the moon. Grandpa said one time that firewood should be cut at the quarter of the moon to prevent it from snapping and throwing embers beyond the hearth. The old-timers had learned from experience that it was best to cut wood from the north side of a tree because it was not as susceptible to warping from dampness or milling. When they cut a pine to get lumber for flooring, they first split the tree in half and kept the northern half, using that half for wide, flat boards. They quarter sawed the southern half for lumber to be used where warping was not as important. Today's furniture is often made from just one kind of wood, but in the old days, a simple rocking chair might contain as many as 7 kinds of wood. Dad and Grandpa, as well as several of my uncles, were excellent chair makers. They knew that wood breathes with the weather, warping, contracting, or expanding with each change of humidity and temperature. If your house creaks and cracks during weather changes, it is built of healthy wood. If you believe the old-timers were backward and superstitious when it comes to working with wood, you should have had a chance to sit a spell with them on Stony Fork, especially during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and learn the wisdom handed down through generations of mountain pioneers. Following the signs of the zodiac was common in the mountains when I was a child. I loved reading in the Farmer's Almanac about signs and wise sayings. I looked up at the stars on clear nights and believed they were friendly to us. I made up stories about the stars, fairies, and devas, wood spirits of the natural world. Another fascinating look into the life of Sidney Saylor Farr. There's a lot about this part I like, but I especially like this part. They knew that wood breathes with the weather, warping, contracting, or expanding with each change of humidity and temperature. If your house creaks and cracks during weather changes, it is built of healthy wood. Our house cracks. There's 1 or 2 places that crack a lot, like she's saying during those changes. And Corey and Katie always said it was the house cracking their knuckles. So I really liked that part. There was a lot in this part of the book, though, that I liked, just like the other chapters that we've read. At the very beginning, when she's talking about the making molasses, I think what she's talking about is the same thing that most people in my area grow, which is sorghum cane, which I think is technically a grass, but we say sorghum cane, but it's sorghum syrup that they were making, and that gets called molasses a lot. It gets really confusing, but I think she's talking about sorghum. But I've never grown sorghum or got to be really part of where I was in charge of making the syrup, but I have seen it made kind of at festivals and different things like that. But also there's a gentleman in Haywood County that I don't know if he still does it, but he used to make syrup every year, and he would invite the general public to come. It was kind of like during the months that he was doing it, I think it was a Friday or a Saturday night, you just knew you could show up and you could help and see, and you could go home with some syrup, you could buy some from him, but it was also like a potluck, so you could bring a dish, and then there would be music, and we went one time, and it was very, very nice and wonderful to be part of that atmosphere. So there's lots of people still making it like that here today. Justin Metcalf, he makes sorghum syrup. Pat, my dad, he had wonderful stories. He loved that time of the year because of kind of the same thing that Sidney was talking about. It was really a time of camaraderie when people gathered together, and just like today, if you get a big bunch of people together, you're going to have some good food to eat. So Pap loved syrup making time, and he loved hog killing time too, because he knew that was going to be not just a lot of good food, but also that fellowship that comes when lots of people come to help you get the chores done. I liked the little part that she was talking about talking kind of about fall with the molasses or the sorghum, but she talked about how that the sky took on this blue. That's one of my favorite things about living here in the mountains, because of the starkness of the mountains against the sky. But during the summer months, it's kind of a hazy look because of the heat and just the humidity. We have so much humidity here, but you have one cool, crisp day, and the sky just takes on this sparkling color of blue. It just, all that humidity's gone from the air, and it's just lovely. So a cool day, it's just wonderful to look up, one of those first fall crisp days, and look up and see the magic of that just startling blue sky. That's one of my favorite things for sure. I like the part where she's talking about, it's kind of funny, talking about her wreath that was dropping off the stuff, but I love that, gathering things from outside to beautify your home. I do that at Thanksgiving. I do that at Christmas. At Christmas, we call that the greening of Christmas, to go out and gather stuff in and bring it in. I was hoping to do that today, but it's a very rainy day in my part of Appalachia today, so there'll be no gathering the greenery today, but I hope to do that in the coming days. So I liked that part. I love that. I love it because it's, if you want to have something pretty, and I love that great outdoors anyway, but to just be able to walk out in your yard, and you can, no matter where you live, I guarantee you could go out and find something. You don't have to have a a wondrous garden or a huge flower bed or evergreen forest or anything like that. If you just look around, you can see some things, whether it's dried weeds or some evergreens or whatever, that's really beautiful that you could snip a little bit, even if you just put it in a little vase and take it into your house. It's just a really wonderful thing, so I liked that part. I thought it was really interesting when she's talking about the planting the potatoes. I know lots of people that still plant them on St. Patrick's Day. But I've never heard that, the 100th day part that she said, the 100th day of the year. I've never heard that before, so I really thought that was interesting. April 10th. I think we would already have ours planted by then, but it wouldn't be too late. You could do that, so I found that part really interesting. And then as she went on to talk about the potatoes, and she said they called them Irish potatoes. So, and I wonder, she spelled it like Irish, like you would spell. But I wonder if they said Irish or if they said Arsh like we do. We say Arsh potatoes to differentiate between white potato and sweet potato. And that usage, Arsh potato, is still common in my family at least. And I loved when she's talking about all the different ways to eat potatoes, we eat them all those ways. But I especially liked when she talked about her mother making the potato cakes. Granny does that. I've tried my whole married life to make potato cakes, tater cakes, we would say, as good as Granny's, and I just can't. Hers are so good. And she makes them often if she has leftover mashed potatoes. That's what she does, and they're so good. I could eat the whole pan by myself. They're just so wonderful. And the grist mill part, the mill and the corn, that was all interesting. And kind of as Sidney says, in days gone by, every community had a mill. They had more than one mill usually if there was a demand, if they needed it. And it is such a change, such a drastic change from those days, and as things, between now and then for sure, but even gradually as things changed, as she was kind of noting in her lifetime how they kind of fell by the wayside, and then people could buy their cornmeal at the store, and they didn't need to grow the corn and take it to get milled. But I like thinking about that. I often have about those grist mills, that how that was the hub of the community. Of course there was churches and schools and all that, but how everyone had to go to the mill. Maybe some people didn't have kids, so they wasn't included in the school stuff, or maybe some people didn't go to church, but everybody had to go to the mill because they had to have that corn ground to feed themselves. So that's a really interesting and fascinating thing to think about. And again, Paps told me wonderful stories himself about having to go to the mill when he was a boy. And then that last part about the timber cutting and the zodiac signs and the phases of the moon, that's really, really interesting too. And lots of people, like she said, especially today, but even when she was writing this book, would just scoff at that and say that's just a bunch of silliness. And you can debate it either way, but it is interesting that over the years, that's how the men or whoever it was doing the cutting, that's kind of how they taught themselves, well, this works and this was going on with the moon, or this didn't work and that was going on, how they learned that knowledge and how it was passed down. So I agree with her. It's kind of sad that knowledge has just fell by the wayside, even more so today than it was when she wrote the book. There are people who still plant by the signs and still believe in following the signs. If it's taking your pacifier away from your baby, or having your any kind of animal, like if maybe you're castrating animals or something like that. So there are certainly still people that do that, but less and less as time goes on. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. Please leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, so we've got to see what happens next to Sidney Saylor Farr.